So welcome to this virtual conference. It's great to have you all with us. This is about making data good for society. So this is a number of events that we're running this week. So if you missed yesterday, don't worry, we've got them recorded. So this is a co-sponsored event by BCS and DAMA UK. So the event is co-sponsored between us, and BCS is the Data Management Specialist Group, and they're a professional body for computing, and their mission is to make IT better for society. And they do this by better use of data, by running related events and supporting development of data-related standards and guidance. And for those of you who haven't heard of DAMA UK, DAMA UK is the organisation, for the go-to organisation for data management professionals. And it's our mission to nurture a community of data professionals in the UK and to champion the value of data as an asset. And I'm your host today, so I'm Lisa Allen. I'm a director of DAMA UK and also the head of consultancy at the Open Data Institute. So as I say, there's a number of events going on today. So if you missed one, don't worry, you'll be able to find it on the DAMA UK or the BCS YouTube channel. So if I just go to the next slide. So by attending the event today, you'll see actually on this one, you'll see there's a hashtag. So if you do want to tweet or use LinkedIn or any social media, you've got the hashtag there. It's easy for me to say, for making data good for society. So that's MDG4S. And we are really lucky today that we've got journalism today who will be digitally recording this session. So if I just go to the next slide, you'll see on here, so by attending today, you'll get a discount in the BCS bookshops. You'll get 30% off list prices. And this is valid between yesterday and on Friday. So if you do want any of those good books, then you can get 30% off those. So before I hand over to Millie, I just wanted to say that we are recording the session today, and it will be available to you. And we're really lucky to have journalism, so we'll come back to journalism doing this digital representation of the conference. So we'll show you what Matt's produced after Millie has spoken. You are all muted, but I really ask you to ask questions. So we've got a really great amount of time to come to you all. So please put your questions in the chat, just as you think of them. Don't wait to the end, and then I'll be able to ask Millie for all those. Okay. So I'm really lucky today to be able to introduce Millie. So Millie is Head of Public Policy at the Open Data Institute, where we're colleagues. And it's great to have you, Millie, today. She's a Senior Policy Advisor, but that's not the only job she's done. She's been a Policy Advisor at the Royal Society and also a Programme Manager at great experiences, amongst others, to be here today. And Millie, you're going to be talking to us about the makers and a holistic view of data skills for society. So I'll hand over to you now, Millie.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Lisa. And my thanks also to DAMA and BCS for the invitation today. I was really thrilled to receive it and really thrilled to be here today. So if we start with the first slide of my presentation, please. Thank you very much. So the title of my talk is The Makers, a Holistic View of Data Skills for Society. And Lisa mentioned that we're colleagues at the ODI, and I'm actually really grateful to Lisa for helping me land on this title after a lot of brainstorming. But hopefully as we get through the talk, you'll see why it was quite sort of difficult to synthesize into just a few words. But I hope I deliver on this vision here. Next slide, please. So if we go to the next slide, please, thank you. So the synopsis for my talk, broadly speaking, is that, making data good for society is a great goal. But who exactly are the makers, and what should we or they be making? So what I hope to do in this session is offer a critical and interdisciplinary exploration of both the breadth of data skills, but also the breadth of benefits to society. So I'm really going to try to interrogate those, the key concepts there. I'll also try to draw on the history of the concept of making, which is right there in Making Data Good for Society, to highlight how soft skills and cultural disciplines and data sets are just as integral to a robust and equitable data ecosystem as the traditionally framed technical skills and hard sciences. and hopefully conclude with some practical steps for policymakers and professional associations like DAMA and BCS, and also senior data managers across sectors. So what you can see here is an outline of the talk. I'll begin with a bit about the ODI, and then I'll kind of offer a critical lens, and then start to look at different aspects of makers, as in making data good for society. So looking at making and then creating, and then finally looking at opportunities for all, and concluding with who are the makers. Next slide, please. Thank you. So a bit about the Open Data Institute, or the ODI. So we were founded in 2012, so still quite a young new organisation, and we're international, independent and not-for-profit. So we're based in London, but we work around the world. Our two co-founders are Sir Nigel Shadbolt and Sir Tim Berners-Lee. You might have heard of them. And our leadership is Dr. Jenny Tennyson, our Vice President and Chief Strategy Advisor, and Louise Burke, our Managing Director. So that's our leadership team. If you go to the next slide, please, So our mission is we work with companies and governments to build an open and trustworthy data ecosystem. And I think it's really important that we work across sectors in that way. It's important for ecosystem change. You're not going to get impact across data ecosystems if you only work with one kind of organization. So we work across the range, but that also really enriches our work in terms of the perspectives and the experience and the insights that we can draw on. So it's quite a holistic way of working, and I'm hoping to bring some of that into the session today. Next slide, please. So our vision is where people, organisations and communities, so that the kind of breadth of stakeholders, can use data to make better decisions and be protected from any harmful impacts. And we sometimes describe this as, we want a world where data works for everyone. And that's something I've been thinking about here, where, who maybe isn't part or hasn't been part of the data conversation so far as much as other stakeholders and communities. And that's something I'd like to explore today. Next slide, please. Thank you. So finally, about the ODI, just a bit about our values. So we try to use these values to guide our work. So we're fearless, we're expert, and we're enabling. And we often come back to our values and challenge ourselves with them when we face difficult decisions or sort of trying to think about strategy and dilemmas. Well, what would be kind of the expert, enabling and fearless position to take? And that's something that has, again, tried to inform my preparation for this session today. And I hope some of what we can achieve together in the dialogue that comes out of it. So some of my material today might seem counterintuitive or surprising, but the effect I'm hoping for is stimulating critical reflection and new ways of thinking and working. So enjoy the experience, and we'll look forward to the Q&A at the end. Brilliant, thank you. So next slide. So let's think about the title of this conference, Making Data Good for Society. As you can see, I put it in quotation marks. So Lisa, thank you for the warm introduction about me and kind of my professional experience. What wasn't included in those comments was the life I had before I started working in data and technology. So I used to be an academic philosopher, so I think a lot about words. And I remember when I got my PhD, one of my cousins went around saying, well, she's a doctor. Oh, we should go back a bit. She's a doctor, but not the kind that helps people. And that's something that really stayed with me. Do I help people? And it's something that, I think we should explore in this talk. Well, what is the value of kind of analytic and critical subjects? Specifically, I studied philosophy of art. So then it's the question about, what is socially useful? Are beautiful things useful? Can their existence be justified? Can public investment in them be justified? And that's part of what I'm going to be trying to look at today. So just thinking about making data good for society, thinking about making and makers. So I'd like to take a critical lens from an alternative culture, because sometimes by switching culture, you get a critical perspective on your own. I'd also like to take a critical lens from comparison over time. So by looking at how a concept or idea has changed over time, you get critical perspective on your moment in history, and you can see different options, different ways of thinking about things and different ways of acting. And I think that ancient Greek gives us both. So ancient Greek is both a different culture as well as a historic culture. So sometimes when you go right back to ancient Greek and use that as a lens to examine modern society, you can see all sorts of different options and different assumptions and so on. And that's what I'll be teasing out. So next slide, please. So here is a beautiful ancient Greek word, techne. Just enjoy that there. And think about the way sort of 2,000 years that word has informed our thinking. So next slide, please. So techne, it's the ancient Greek root word behind modern concepts like technical and technology. In the original, in the ancient Greek, it means craft. It means the capacity to make. It's agnostic between science and art. It's just about the capacity to make, techne. So what I'll be doing is exploring the shades of meaning of techne to shed lights on opportunities to exercise techne, to make, the capacity to make data good for society now. Next slide, please. So, one sense of techne in ancient Greek is techne is skill. The capacity to make is a skill. So let's examine that. So I think that we tend to think of data skills as quantitative skills, as quant skills, but I'd like to disagree. So data skills are also interdisciplinary skills, and we see that in data projects. You need both domain knowledge of the problem that you're solving, as well as technical knowledge, the quantitative knowledge, right? But you also need soft skills in a data project. So it's not enough to do quantitative analysis in a data project. You also need to think about the implementation of that project, some of the social impacts, some of the interpersonal kind of skills you'll need to either make the project fly or to kind of deal with the consequences of the project. So to make with data, quant skills aren't sufficient for data skills. You need the full range. And if we go to the next slide, please, I can show you the ODI's data skills framework. So this is a tool that we use both for developing our own internal capacity, but also when we offer training to other organizations. It's the data skills framework. It's free to download on our website. And it's thinking about all the different range of data skills needed in a data project. So of course, you've got the kind of quantitative skills in there, but look, you've also got strategy skills. You've also got change management skills because a data project is a change project. You've got data visualization because it's not just about the analysis, it's about the interpretation and telling a story that others can understand and kind of, cooperate with you around. So it's quite a range of skills around the kind of techne is making. Next slide, please. So here's another aspect for me from techne as skill, techne as making. So techne gives us technical, but I don't think data skills are purely technical roles. So I think we're also seeing increasingly that we need data skills for civic identity and participation. So you need to be able to think critically about data to understand, for example, the COVID models that are being used by government now for thinking about risks around, say, transmission exposure and so on. So it's not enough for that to be owned by a kind of technical elite. Data skills have to be democratic and have to be owned by the population at large as part of civic identity and participation. And in a moment, I'll say a bit more about the data ethics canvas and our work on inclusive data. But equally, we think that data skills, it's not just about the technical engagement with the data, but about that holistic thinking about the context of the problem as a whole. So it's what questions are being asked of this data? What kinds of analysis are we doing on it? And are those the right questions to ask? Is that the right kind of analysis to be doing on this data? So it's a much broader and much more holistic approach to thinking about how we use data in our society. And it's really quite interesting because, one of our new programs at the ODI is around data assurance. And that's kind of about, sort of the data that's being used and reused by organizations being trusted and trustworthy. And an aspect of that, a really key aspect of that is around kind of like understanding the limitations of the data and communicating what those limitations are so that the end result of that data use can be trusted by the end user or by other organizations who are using that data. So it's essential to data ecosystems that we have that, critical thinking about the data and not just technical analysis of the data. Finally, it's also thinking about the kind of critical questions about the models. So it's thinking, what are the assumptions in the questions that we are asking? And that's where you can kind of find things like social bias or, kind of blind spots in our knowledge that then inform the kinds of critical questions we ask of the data. And again, at the ODI, our way of kind of trying to mitigate this is something that we call data literacy. And we think that data literacy is just as important as financial literacy. You know, it's the kind of thinking holistically in an interdisciplinary way about the context of the data collection and the data use. And if we go to the next slide, I'll say a bit more about the data ethics canvas and inclusive data. So here is the ODI's data ethics canvas, and it's a tool for critical thinking about the ethical implications of a project you're about to start. We recommend doing it, you know, at the start of a project, just to test yourself about, you know, what are the assumptions here, what are the blind spots, what are the different ways of, I guess, sort of making sure this project is robust. And we ourselves have used this data ethics canvas in our own work. So in the autumn, we were doing a piece of work around pandemic response and looking at a mix of data sources to try to assess the impact of emergency school closures on children. And some of our data was from Mumsnet, the social media company. Some was from Bernardo's, the civil society organization. So it's really exciting to have that collaboration across sectors. But we recognized that there would be limitations in the data. We recognized that it wouldn't be representative of the population as a whole, because it would be biased towards, say, those who have good internet connection, you know, perhaps, or, you know, those who feel confident kind of asking for help from civil society organizations. And there were ways in which maybe some of the more vulnerable families or communities would not be represented in that data. So the question we had to ask ourselves using our data ethics canvas is this the right thing to do? Should we do this analysis, knowing that it might be flawed? And our data ethics canvas was also useful for asking ourselves the question, well, what are the consequences of not doing this research? You know, this is a piece of pandemic response, it's urgent and it's timely. And maybe there's a trade-off between something that's perfectly accurate, but slow, versus something that can be a rapid response, can help address an immediate need now, as long as we signal in a sort of data assurance way what the limitations of our data are. So there's different ways of using the data ethics canvas to ask yourselves the right critical questions. And we see that as really part of data literacy and an aspect of data skills. Next slide, please. So thinking again about the sense of techne as making. So there's this kind of narrative that, you know, data skills, there's a brain drain happening of data scientists to the tech sector, to the private sector. And there's an element of truth in that, but it's not the whole story. So when I was at the Royal Society, one of our reports was around dynamics of data science skills, and it was looking at the kind of, you know, I guess the talent pipeline in the data science ecosystem, including roles like, you know, data engineering and so on, and data visualization. And what we found was that, you know, of course, you know, people are attracted by salary, but they're also significantly motivated by intellectual challenge, by a team environment, and by the opportunity to work on socially interesting problems and make a contribution to social good. It's just that the frameworks weren't in place to allow them to act upon that in the way that they wanted to. So there weren't as many mechanisms for, you know, people to, I don't know, maybe have a job in industry, but do voluntary work as a data scientist for civil society, or go on to comment from one to the other. So the motivators are there, the drivers are there in the data science community. It's just about getting the frameworks in place to allow that career mobility between sectors and across different kinds of roles. And I would really encourage civil society and the public sector to feel confident about the value of the proposition that you offer the data community. You know, people want to work on interesting problems, they want to contribute to society, and they value the quality of the team environment and the career opportunities. So it's thinking about the narrative that we have around I suppose, the technical skills of the data scientists as makers. Okay, thank you. So next slide, please. So here's another aspect of techne in ancient Greek. So we've got, you know, techne is the capacity to make, but it's also the capacity to create. And so techne was used agnostically across both the sciences and the arts in ancient Greek. And I think it's really important because, you know, in kind of modern English, we've got that hard dichotomy, science and art, whereas that wouldn't have been the case 2000 years ago. What was respected and appreciated was the craft, was the skill, it was the fact of bringing something new into existence for society. And I think that certainly in our kind of modern, you know, European culture, we get this, I think C.P. Snow talks about the two cultures, where he kind of created this polarity between, you know, science and arts. And he was quite an kind of influential thinker about civil service as well, and about Whitehall. So I wonder whether that's, you know, where we can trace some of this, you know, dichotomy between the sciences and the arts that's maybe not helpful for the world we want to make now and how we want to use data in it. But specifically, I think that data and data science is for art and artists too. So at the ODI, we have this exciting work stream called Data as Culture. You might have seen it around. And what it is we commission artists to kind of work either with data or to work around data in creative ways. And this has been fantastic for both the kind of critical perspectives and the questions that they ask about data and digital technologies, but also for the ways that they bring in new audiences and they bring in diverse audiences to engage with data and digital technology in a way that we wouldn't have been able to do just with a kind of, I suppose, a science project. So I'm just thinking about one of the artists that we're working with in Data as Culture. One of their projects, A.M. Dark, the artist is called, one of their projects is creating a kind of an open source library of afro hairstyles for computer games, for 3D characters in computer games. And just for me personally, it's fantastic because, you know, when you're doing little icons of characters, you know, they have so many versions of straight hair and there'll be the one token afro, you know, and it's really fantastic that they're thinking about making video games inclusive and diverse and representative. And in that way, allowing kind of video game players to see themselves reflected and to kind of participate differently in that tech world. So it's that kind of creative and diverse kind of integration of both, you know, science and art, I think. So it's techne as art, it's techne as creating, and I reject the dichotomy between science and art here. So next slide, please. So here's another way in which I think the art community has a really valuable contribution to make in terms of making data good for society and what we want to achieve. So typically, I think we often think of socially useful data as being, I don't know, engineering data or, you know, medical data. But I think there's a strong argument for thinking about cultural data as socially useful too. And also thinking about arts organizations as technical innovators and as scientific innovators. So I'd like to tell you a bit about a project that we were showcasing a few months ago that's being led by the BFI, the British Film Institute. So what the BFI have done is gone through 250 years of their archives, of their catalogue of films, you know, films made in Britain. And they have used new computational techniques to retrospectively genderize all named film contributors or crew members in their collection. So that's 250 years worth of film archives and film catalogue. They've got named contributors, maybe just initials, maybe acronyms, you know, and these haven't been genderized. They don't have a kind of record of, you know, kind of trajectories of women in film in the different roles, whether that's writers or actors or in the crew. But what they've done is they've used data science to go back and retrospectively genderize that in order to track the history of gender equality in the film industry, which is really exciting. It's a really exciting technical development, but also really exciting use of that. And in that way, it allows them to identify, well, what has been the pattern in our industry and what needs to be improved, where do the interventions need to be made by having that historic lens. That new computational technique could also be used in other industries where there hasn't been, you know, accurate record keeping over their history to track gender equality. You can retrospectively model that, you know. So this is I think this is really fantastic. And here you've got an arts organization using cultural data for the social good and innovating in scientific techniques. That's something that I really want to highlight and maybe think differently about what counts as socially useful data and where innovations might come out of. Next slide, please. So again, thinking about, you know, sort of like techne as art and the creative aspect of techne. So I think that cultural infrastructure can be a part of social infrastructure. And again, we tend to think of, you know, certain parts of, you know, I guess of national infrastructure and you know, as our social infrastructure. So again, thinking about the health service, thinking about the transport network. But again, I think there's an argument to be made for our cultural institutions being a key part of our social infrastructure. Related to this, I think that cultural organizations are data users too. It's not just the organizations, you know, that have like kind of strong assets in the sciences and engineering that are data users. We're increasingly seeing the cultural organizations active data users and recognize the value of the data assets that they have. Cultural organizations are also capacity building in their local communities, and they're part of, you know, kind of thinking about regional disparities and addressing those and creating opportunities locally. So one particular project I want to draw attention to is work that the ODI that we're doing with the Collections Trust, which is a kind of pan-UK organisation for the museum sector. So what we're doing is we're working with them to develop a framework and standards for kind of, being able to kind of curate, for each museum to be able to curate its data collection about the artifacts or the objects in its collection and share that data with other museums. And then to say what that allows is for museums across the country to be able to kind of like organize loans of artifacts efficiently, or maybe if they've got something in their archive that they're not really using, but another museum somewhere else would make good use of it, allows that object to be shared. So it's thinking about, how local communities could benefit from this rather than everything being in London. Just thinking about that, or thinking about the education programs that could arise from this, thinking about the kind of the training opportunities, thinking about the public engagement opportunities, but also thinking about strategic investment in the sector as a whole, when all the organizations in it can share data and cooperate in that way. So it's thinking differently about our national infrastructure, thinking differently about what investment in our society means, and thinking differently about the role of cultural organizations and their relationship to data in that opportunity. So next slide, please. Thank you. So having kind of thought about the kind of different shades of meaning around techne, both the kind of making but also creating, the sciences and the arts, and so-called technical skills and so-called soft skills, bringing them together. I think it's important to think about practical next steps for everyone here. So opportunities for all is not just opportunities for society, but opportunities right here for us. So thinking, what can policymakers do? This is a fantastic time to be involved in data policy in the UK because the National Data Strategy is in development and implementation, and there's lots of really exciting opportunities there. And this is something that we at the ODI are working with the DCMS team and the National Data Strategy team on. So for example, thinking about who counts as a data organisation, I think it's really important that we recognise that increasingly every organisation is a data organisation. It's not just the Googles and the Apples and the Facebooks and the kind of tech startups. Every organisation is a data organisation, and when we think about working differently with the data we already have, rather than only thinking about high-tech sensors to capture more data, there's so many exciting opportunities we can that we can leverage with the data we already have. And again, thinking about the BFI example, you can use computational techniques to kind of maybe mitigate gaps or issues in the data collections from historic collections, the stuff that we can do now. So it's just thinking in that holistic sense. Related, thinking about what counts as a strategic data set. So again, there's obvious arguments in favour of medical and health data, and in favour of kind of things like engineering data and so on. But let's think differently about kind of different aspects of cultural data, different aspects of socially collected data. One area that the ODI is quite active on is thinking about data institutions, which are organisations that steward data on behalf of communities. So thinking about the data that community organisations collect about their own communities, because they're trusted by those communities in a way that maybe a government department would not be. So there's all sorts of interesting data sets out there, and thinking about ways of enabling and facilitating working with that data for the greater good of society, of all of us. And finally, it's thinking about data literacy for civil servants. So often the emphasis is on kind of technical skills, I guess quantitative skills for civil servants, but we're strongly in favour of that holistic sense of data literacy. So thinking about the questions that are being asked of the data and the models that are being used. So earlier I said that one of our projects had been around inclusive data, and with that we were preparing for the ONS consultation on inclusive data in national statistics, and we convened sort of community organisations and so on to ask, well, how could the UK's national data collections be more representative and also be more useful to different communities. And the kind of feedback we got was things like, well, it's making sure that the people who are collecting the data have emotional intelligence about the questions that they are asking. So some questions, for data collection are politically sensitive, or might require the data subject to disclose something confidential. So it's kind of cultivating that emotional and political intelligence in those who are undertaking data projects in order to get participation from maybe economically or socially vulnerable or excluded people. It's also thinking about the ways that we can empower different organisations to be involved in data collection for government. So it's thinking, well, who would be most trusted here and most effective at collecting this data? Or what are the questions that this community has? So rather than a top-down approach saying, well, these are the questions that, that central government has, it's thinking, well, what are the questions that this community would like to be answered with their data? What's the kind of analysis that this community would find helpful to meet their goals of kind of, social kind of and economic prosperity and thriving? So it's that critical and holistic thinking. Next slide, please. So thinking about opportunities for all, specifically maybe, for example, what can DAMA and BCS do? So here I'm thinking, well, maybe that's holistic thinking about professional competencies. So I mentioned the Royal Society report I was involved in about a couple of years ago. One of the outcomes of that was, I think, BCS working with the Royal Statistical Society and with operational research and a few of the other learned societies like the Royal Society and the Royal Academy of Engineering to create a professional framework for, for data scientists and thinking about the different competencies involved. And I would say that's a fantastic opportunity for professional associations to, use their influence and their kind of leadership in the domain to shape the kind of professional community that we'd like to see that can make the most of these strategic opportunities. And it might be there's something in there around interdisciplinary backgrounds. It might be that there's something around there, around developing emotional intelligence and valuing that. And there might be that there's something around there around the narrative around data careers. So maybe having that counter narrative that it's not just money that matters, but the kind of career mobility across sectors and the chance to do rewarding work, and using that to negotiate for the kinds of opportunities we'd like to see more of for this professional community. Thank you. Next slide, please. And finally, it's thinking about, well, what can data managers do? What can the participants in this conference do? What's in your power to do? So I think there's something there around maybe engagement or outreach across sectors for impact and inspiration. So as I've said, I think every organization is a data organization. So think about who you're not already working with, which sectors you're not already working with, and maybe think about, ways you could collaborate with them, or what you could, what dialogues you could have with them. I think the challenges that we face as a society are not bound by sector. Climate change isn't going to just, it's not just going to be, amongst environmentalists. We've all got a part to play in that, right? So it's thinking, well, by opening up the dialogue, what sort of cross-sector, cross-disciplinary challenges could you solve together? It's also thinking about engagement and outreach across communities. So it's not just which kind of disciplines or sectors are you not already in touch with, which communities, are you not already in touch with? And I will, share some of my own experience, just because I think that, as I've said, our ODI values are fearless, expert in enabling. So I'm happy to talk about blind spots in my own experience. So, I'm a Black woman, and there's a kind of intersectionality there, right, from both gender and ethnicity. So I thought I was quite well informed about kind of inclusive practice. But when a few months ago we did our ODI project on inclusive data, I met people from communities that I had no previous contact with. For example, we had a rep from a kind of Gypsy, Romani and Traveller community talking about their community data collection work. And I realized it was something that I'd never known about, but never even thought to ask about, right? And I encountered my own social blind spots there. So again, just really thinking and maybe using something like our data ethics canvas to think, well, who isn't in the room, and what are the questions that aren't being asked, and use that to help identify blind spots and think more broadly about who else could be involved. And finally, and perhaps my most controversial point yet, I'm leaving it till the end. So I think that maybe there's an opportunity to think differently about data stewardship. I think at the moment we tend to think about data governance in terms of data protection. And that's really important. We have obligations around data protection. But I invite you to consider whether we might have obligations around ensuring that the data that we have access to and that we manage and that we steward, ensuring that it's used for the public good. And so stewarding is not just a kind of custodian, defensive, passive position, but an active position about creating, about technate, about doing new things to get an effect, to get an impact for others. And I think that's quite challenging when we come from this kind of culture of, data governance is data protection. It's about closing things. To think actually maybe data governance is about opening things and making sure data assets are used well. And it's something that we've seen, in the open data community in Canada. So one of our projects was on open cities, about data sharing in cities and local authorities. And for that, we convened an international roundtable with reps from around the world. And one of the reps from Canada said that, look, in their particular city, there was a narrative around, look, this is data that's been, data about citizens that's been collected and curated with their taxpayers' money, right? So government has an obligation to make sure this data is used for the good of those citizens. And I wonder whether there's something similar there around the obligations around data governance and data stewardship. So to wrap up, next slide, please. So who are the makers? Remembering that techne means capacity to make. I think it's all of us. I hope you also think it's all of us. But I think we all have the opportunity and kind of maybe an obligation to make in different ways. It's not the same role, but it's a role and an opportunity that all of us have. So next slide, please. Any questions? Thank you.
Excellent, thank you, Millie. That was really insightful. I think taking us through history and also across disciplines is a really good way of looking at things. So before we come to the questions, what we'll do is we'll just show the work from Matt from journalism. So let me see if I can spotlight. Oops, hang on, I'm not doing very well at this. Matt, could you speak so you can come up as the spotlight? Oh, hang on, spotlight, I've managed it. There we go. Sorry, so if you can get your questions in the chat while we look at this, and then Matt will take us through the drawings that from the presentation. Over to you, Matt.
Hello, Lisa, thank you. Thanks very much. It was a wonderful talk full of great insightful things, and it starts up here with the makers. And in paraphrase, there was a lot of talking about enabling change and broadening understanding as part of the mission of the ODI. And you can see building an open data ecosystem, which is one of their purposes. This obviously ties in beautifully with the subject for this week. And a really good challenging question right at the start, can beautiful things be useful? Obviously, we really got behind that. So that's a wonderful thing. And then there was some very interesting historical parallels around Greek philosophy and the capacity to make, and the natural distinction that sometimes people draw that hard skills or mathematical skills or quant skills in the characterization is it. And actually, proposition was that data and change, because their data is always changing, is multidisciplinary. So there was a wander through what that might mean for things like data literacy and the importance of understanding the context and thought in which it is applied to applications of data and projects. And there was a good example from the ODI about how they're choosing to try and characterize this in the data ethics canvas and the effects that this has on the change that's going on in society. There's another challenge around an arguably false divide between art and science, as if they're entirely separate and aren't intimately related. And there's an incautious joke there, data is culture. And there was a good example that Millie gave about haircuts, which was very important. And the value of cultural data might be a gateway into growing things like data literacy, and that would have real use and utility for some of the things that came up in yesterday's presentations and webinars. And that's a really powerful local opportunity for empowered communities, which can work with things like the National Data Strategy and everyone who's involved in it. And finally, way over here is a challenge that Millie finished with. And that's it.
Perfect. Thank you, Matt. Right, I'm just going to spotlight you, Millie. And Glenn, I'm just giving you over the host, just to let you know. Okay, so I've got some of the questions now, Millie. So if I just run through, so we had a couple of people asking about the data skills framework and the data ethics canvas. So I put both of those in the chat. if I go to some of the questions now, so I think we've got some of the comments as well coming through, Millie. So coming from a cultural organisation, I completely agree with this. So I think it's a really interesting point, isn't it, that you've had, that you're combining both the cultural side of things as well as the previously, I think data is always seen as more of a scientific area, isn't it? So we've had a flag up. So somebody says, please could you, so Margaret Ross has said, please could you expand the range of diversity you've identified in computer games? There's also a BCS event, actually, Millie, you might be interested in on later in the week. So yeah, can you expand on the range of the diversity you've identified in those computer games examples?
Thank you, and also thank you to Matt for that really beautiful kind of pictorial representation. I loved it, and I'm looking forward to looking at it in more detail later. So just on the range of video games, it's more that Margaret, it's more that there's an artist that we're working with, and I was looking up their work, and I found their kind of 3D Afro hair library. I can post it in chat. So it's not that I know a lot about different options in computer games. It's more like I'm just really impressed by this artist's work and all the different things that they're doing. I think just from my own experience of digital technology, I'm just really interested in the ways it can reverse power imbalances in society and structural inequalities rather than replicate them. So I'm glad that attention is being paid to the ways in which digital tech can reinforce social inequalities. But I really welcome conversations about the way digital tech can maybe help reverse some of those and make our society more inclusive. But should I post the 3D Afro hair library in chat? Would that be helpful?
That would be helpful. Yeah. Do you want us to give you a minute? I'll just start to look at the next question while you'll do that, because it will distract you. Just give you a minute to post it. So you're right if I start to read out the next question, Millie? Is that going to be all right?
Yeah, thank you.
We're going to multitask at the same time. Okay, so this is from Glenn. So thinking about different groups of people, whether professionals or socioeconomic groups, races, etc., tend to distinguish themselves by developing their own language. So government organisations are very prone to this, and the world of data is leading to a raft of new words. What should happen to avoid government-related bodies from leaving the populace behind by implicitly developing a whole new language for aspects of data? So what do you think about that language then of data and how that's changing?
It's really interesting point, really important. So yeah, communities just develop their own languages. That's what people do. And I don't think the intention is always to leave people behind or exclude, but sometimes it's one of the consequences. I think there's value in a community having their own language. Maybe it could be because, it might be that it's a specialist language, or that they need to refer to things in their history that is not a shared history with others. But if it becomes too fragmented, then it stops dialogue, across communities. I guess. So maybe rather than government avoiding leaving the population behind, maybe it's about thinking, well, could government maybe pick up some of the language that's used in the wider public, or what can be done to make sure that the wider public have opportunities to learn the language that the government's using. So maybe it's about direction of travel in both directions and finding common ground. Maybe it's about thinking which conversations or documents do need to be in a specialist language and which don't. And equally, back to my point about inclusive data, when are the times when government might need to learn another language to be able to engage with other communities on their own terms? So there's more than one way around this, I think, and I guess it's thinking about the impact that could be had for good or for bad. Does that help? Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, actually. I think there's another one actually that's come up in language. So what can we do using different data skills to get a data heavy message across when there are data literacy issues in the wider society? So we are making wider use of data visualization. Is this the best way? So what's the best way of trying to get some of that data heavy? Because we all know, don't we, data can get quite technical quite quickly. So how can we do that to get that wider data literacy across the wider society?
So I'm just going to point out that I've just given you a presentation about ancient Greek etymology, and so far no one has complained. So I'm full of optimism. I'm full of optimism that like technical and obscure material can be made relevant and engaging. I think it's all about the intention and so on. So there's lots of different sort of data communication and data interpretation skills. And so if you look at our ODI data skills framework, that includes data visualization, right? Because it illustrates a data analysis or a problem or a question. Maybe the question is, who is the audience? So what kind of presentation is useful to them? and what is the subject matter. So it's gauging what would be appropriate for the subject matter and for the audience. And sometimes people don't need to know the granularity, that's distracting. And sometimes knowing the granularity is empowering, So it's thinking, well, what's the intended outcome and for whom, and making sure that that's factored in. I would also caution against thinking that data is always the solution. So you might find that once you've made your kind of data or your analysis accessible and engaging, people still don't reach the conclusion you think that they're going to, or people still aren't interested, and that's their right, And I think it's just avoiding a kind of almost like a text solutionism, that thinking data is always the answer. Data is fantastic. Data is a really powerful tool, but it can never be the totality of our experiences, right? And people have the right to just walk away, and that's okay too.
Excellent, thanks, Millie. And we've got one here from Neil Burston. So it's a great presentation, philosophy and cross-skilled thinking. So excellent there. An obvious question, but what would be the first steps you would recommend for an organisation looking to build these skills and the capacity to make?
So we do have a training team at the Open Data Institute. So I'd say have a look on our website with our data skills framework. We've also got sort of various courses. I guess I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer in terms of the first steps. Maybe it's about thinking about the data maturity of the organization. Where are you at, and what do you want to achieve? Because it's not necessary for everyone to become a high-tech organization for the things that they want to achieve. It's what's the right level of data maturity, what kinds of data capacity would be most useful for you. And so when I was at the Royal Society, one thing that we saw a lot of was, lots of hype around, kind of the people designing algorithms, but the real need was around people who would clean the data, it's the data wrangling and the data engineering. So it's just having a realistic assessment about what's the need, what do you want to achieve, what's the right way to go about it. It might not be, the kind of, some of the stuff that you read in newspapers, and it might be, what's the best way to serve your community. It might just be about, using freedom of information better. So again, one of our projects with on open cities, working with local authorities, I think it was North Lanarkshire Council, they made a strategic decision that every freedom of information request that they received was a sign of a kind of service failure, because it meant that people had questions that the council weren't answering, right? And it was also kind of admin cost and burden to them. So they made a decision to publish more data, to kind of proactively be more open about some of their data. That reduced the number of freedom of information requests, which meant that people, their queries are being answered, but also it created more collaboration and innovation opportunities, because when the data's there, organizations can see how they get involved. Whereas when the data's not there, there's a barrier to participating. They've got to make a freedom of information request, they've got to wait. So by publishing that data, they improved the community engagement, they created more opportunities for innovation, they reduced admin costs. So and that was just thinking about publishing data and anticipating FOI. So there's different ways of working with the data you've already got, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a great example, isn't it? I think that's really turning it on its head. And I think that takes a lot of courage, doesn't it, for organizations to really be that transparent and brave, but actually they realize they're going to get their questions anyway. So it's a really good thing to do, is to switch that mindset, isn't it?
Yeah, I thought it was brilliant. Exactly that. They decided to evaluate their performance by reducing FOI requests and use that as a measure or a metric of kind of community engagement. I thought it was brilliant.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's also important, isn't it, for context, for where different organizations are starting from. So your context of your organization, some are more mature in certain areas. And I think that context means that there's no one size fits all. So it's about choosing the right thing for you.
Exactly, and starting with where you're at, and it doesn't have to be a high-tech solution, just working with the data assets you've already got.
Excellent. And we had a request here, Matt, for what tool are you using for your awesome drawings? So Matt, I don't know if you want to put in the chat the tool you're using. Then we have one from Tracy. So great presentation. Thank you, Millie. I'd be interested in knowing your views knowing your views on considering the balance of power in this arena. Inequalities of the world appear to be becoming more extreme. And my thoughts are that it's the result of pace of database platform organizations gaining market share and power, and being able to monopolize power. What do you think about, what's your thoughts on this, Millie, about that, the extremes?
I mean, it's a huge question, and some of it's about digital technology, I think, rather than data. So, and some of it's about sort of tax regimes, for example, that's allowed, some of the players in the tech industry to just kind of, accumulate vast capital assets. But again, you know, the tech industry also includes SMEs. It also includes, you know, local businesses and so on. So it's kind of, as Lisa was saying, it's not one size fits all. And the tools for addressing inequalities may not always be data tools. They might be policy tools, like, as we're seeing now, maybe tax interventions and so on. So yeah, I think maybe also the patterns might be different in different countries or different sectors. So we're certainly seeing some global inequalities, but there are some areas where, you know, I'm optimistic about the role of data and digital tech in reducing inequalities or lowering the barriers to participation, so community organisations can get involved or communities can get involved in different ways. So I tend to focus on that because I feel like there's positive things I can do there. And, you know, it's making data good for society. And it's, well, what can we do? What is in our power to do?
Do you think there's more things, Millie, to hold them to account, maybe through the data ethics and things? Because obviously some of these algorithms, the data are working on getting a response, aren't they? And sometimes that response is not always the positive response, you know, that is good for society. So actually holding more the companies to this ethical standard may help with trying to rebalance this.
Definitely. I mean, part of the difficulty is that a lot of them have come up with their own ethical codes. They've tried to preempt it by coming up with their own ethical codes. But I think it needs international cooperation, right? Because they work internationally, and it's interesting how you know, by working internationally, it's made it difficult for lawmakers in any one country to handle it. But again, thinking about the positive, the same opportunity applies to civil society, that you can get transnational organisation of community groups, you know. So it's not just the kind of private sector that can work across national borders, so can community organisations. So it's thinking about what we can do.
Excellent, thanks, Millie. So coming on to Rena's question. So how do individual researchers get around the hurdle of access to relevant data, which might exist, but private? So is that about the issue of getting hold of private data for your research? What are your thoughts about getting access to data generally?
So Rima, that's why I moved to working in data policy. So my role at the Turing was kind of managing research projects and trying to get data, you know, data access for our researchers project by project. And I just thought, well, you know, I can do this one project at a time, or I can step back and, you know, do data. And it's roughly the same time that the National Data Strategy was starting to work. So there's one thing that we did at the Turing that I think was the right strategy was when we developed research projects, we tried to develop use cases or case studies that would be high impact and that would help create the evidence base for the positive change that we want to see in the world. So I think it's thinking about using your research or your project idea to create evidence base for positive impact, and that makes it easier for others to follow in your footsteps and for more work like that to be built off it. So we were really strategic and tactical about the kinds of projects that we requested data access for in order to show what was possible and get more buy-in for doing more of the kinds of things that we thought should be done. So I hope that can help in the meantime. Until you feel like working in data policy, come join us.
Excellent, thanks, Millie. Rena said, sure, thank you. So that's really good. I think we've got a combat there. So I think we've got all the questions now that have been through. So it just leaves me to say thank you, Millie, for that awesome presentation. That's been really, really brilliant and really insightful. I think it's taken us on a different viewpoint than we'd usually have from data. So for everybody else, just want to say to you that this afternoon we have got another presentation, and that is the world map is missing 1 billion people. We can change this. So this is from the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap. So if you want to tune in this afternoon, that's at 4 o'clock. The slides, well, the journalism will be available from Matt later, and obviously the presentation will also be available and recorded on our website. So it just leaves me to say thank you again, Millie. That was absolutely awesome. And I hope everybody has a brilliant day, and I shall see you later this afternoon.
Thank you.
See you later.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Brilliant. Bye.